My mother's involvement with the synagogue and the shows started when she moved to Hamilton. She was very friendly with Bubbles Benjamin in Toronto, who was the sister of Trudy Adler and Dr. Meyer Carr. And Bubbles told Trudy that my mother had done these shows in Toronto where the ladies would get together and they would make these box lunches, and my mother would put together an entertainment, and then the men would come and everyone would see the show and the men would bid on the box lunches, and that was a way for them to that the sisterhood raised money for the synagogue. So Trudy was the sisterhood president, and she asked my mom to do a show for the synagogue, and that was how it started. And she did a few shows. I was very young and don't remember a lot of details or a lot of things. Some of them I do remember. She wrote a show called The Westdale Story, which was the story that the son of the Gabbai from one synagogue fell in love with the daughter of the cantor from the other synagogue, and it was a big to-do. And she wrote song parodies, and Jaime Kaplan played the Tony part, and Helen Greenbaum played Maria. And I remember that Jaime had kind of this lisp thing, and Maria's name in the play, her last name was Dubinsky. And Jaime sang, "Dubinsky, I just met a girl named Dubinsky." And we were kids. I was, I think, maybe around 10. She directed a production of Hans Christian Andersen, and the day before we did the show, the decision came down and they changed the name of the show to Hans Chaim Andersen. And I sang a duet with Johnny Levy about "No two people shall ever be so in love," and Nancy Mintz and Marvin Karen, and all of the kids from the synagogue, and there were lots of us, were in the production. And as far as I know, that was the only show she ever did with young people. She wrote quite sophisticated lyrics, and she loved to get people together. She had her group of people. Later on, she worked with, excuse me, Leah Levine was her rehearsal pianist. And Lillian Goldblatt was always in the show. She was also a star. She had a beautiful voice. I remember they did a fundraiser to raise money to redo the social hall, and Lillian sang this song, "This stage is too small for the sound of music, and this social hall is too bare and cold. There's no room to dance to the sound of music." And the song goes on, and she had the men come up and sing, and today probably most people wouldn't know the song, to the tune of "Stout-Hearted Men." "Give me 10 men who are Beth Jacob men, and I'll give you 10,000 more." And they managed to raise the money to redo the social hall, which at the time that it was done was beautiful, and it had a stage for her to use for future productions. And she really liked to do that. She was very involved in that way with the synagogue. I grew up in the shul, spent a lot of time there. We went to Hebrew school, and my dad was the treasurer. And I remember there would be stories about, he was rather relentless about collecting dues. So if someone was having a simcha, on the Friday of the weekend of the simcha, he would call Maxie, who was the only caterer working at the shul, and he would tell Maxie that the kitchen was locked and he couldn't get in, and that until the dues were paid, there was going to be no cooking going on. So of course Maxie would frantically call the person who was having the simcha and say, "I can't get into the kitchen, you have to deal with this." And my dad would say, "Come down with cash or a certified check and I'll open up the kitchen for you." And he always got paid. We used to go to Hebrew school in a little building next door, and when they built I guess an extension onto the shul, my dad donated all of the windows for the shul, He had a factory and he had a lot of people who worked for him whenever it snowed. My father was the one who sent the crew to shovel out the shul, and it was very important for him. It was a big part of his life growing up, and even after he moved to Hamilton, my grandfather would call him from Toronto and say, "Sie schneit," and then hang up the phone, and my dad would send a crew to shovel out the shul in Toronto as well. When Rabbi Silverman came to the synagogue, I was 2 years ahead of myself in school and had therefore in higher Hebrew school grade as well. And Rabbi Silverman divided us up. So it was the first time we had a December bat mitzvah and a June bat mitzvah. And there were 12 of us in the group. And we put our names into a hat, and the winner, the father of the winner, was going to get to say the mafter, because in those years, of course, we didn't read from the Torah and we only did the Haftorah. So I won. And I came home and I said to my dad, I won, and you're going to get to do the mafter at my bat mitzvah. And he said, "You couldn't win me a TV?" So Rabbi Cantor Adler, I'm not exactly sure what his position was. Cantor Zimmerman was the cantor, but Mr. Adler, he recorded the mafter for my dad onto a cassette, and my dad would go into the den after dinner every night and he'd turn on the cassette player and promptly fall asleep. So somehow he sleep learned it and he managed to do it well. We had a great time at Hebrew school. We would take the bus and everybody got along, and there were a lot of kids there then. And it was a magical time. My parents had great friends, and Molly and Bill Schreiber. Bill Schreiber had, I think, no knee on his left leg, so he always had to sit on the aisle seat in shul. And if you ever look at anybody's wedding pictures of them walking down the aisle, you always see Bill Schreiber's leg just sticking out into the aisle. And Maxie and Samuth Mintz, and Marvin and Lillian, and Barbara and Abby, and Sandy and Malcolm, and Trudy and Abby, and it was just, they were beautiful people, and they worked hard for the shul, and they had a great time doing it. And it was really magical times. After high school, I moved down to the States, and I lived there for many years, always coming home on the high holidays to be in shul with my parents. And then as tragedy struck my family and I lost first my brother Andy, Rabbi Silverman was really wonderful to my parents at that time, and they became quite close. And eventually I came back to Hamilton with my mom, and when she passed away I started going to shul to say Kaddish for her, and found all of the reasons that I couldn't wait to leave Hamilton were what I liked about being back, this sense of community and feeling of belonging in the synagogue. And people were very welcoming, and I started going regularly, and there was a great comfort there in being in this place where my family had such an impact. And a few months after my mom passed away, Larry Rosenberg talked to me about doing something at the shul like my mom used to do. And I thought, well, you know, I could write a few songs and I could do something. And it started out as a concept for a cabaret evening, but just kept writing, and it grew and grew until eventually I had all of these songs, and then I needed a story, which I then wrote the story, and we cast it from the community, and there were people in the show from 4 years old to Frank Shapiro, who was 80 at the time, Maxie, who was in his 80s. And it was so special to have Maxie in the show because he had been such a part of my mother's life and everything that she did at the synagogue, that to have him up there, and I took a song that she wrote and I added another verse on, and it's still one of Maxie's favorite songs to sing. And the show just kept growing, and being in the building again, which at that time, the building, it was like things were pretty down and there wasn't a lot of activity. And so all these people coming into rehearsing all the time, it really breathed some life into it. And about I kept saying to the cast, you guys buy your tickets, we're going to sell out, we're going to sell out. And 2 weeks before the show, we were sold out, and childhood friends of mine, their parents were calling me looking for tickets. And so a week before the show, we moved it into the Sanctuary. We ended up selling 603 tickets. And that night, the feeling in the room was electric. It was like the good old days. It was just this really wonderful feeling. And after the show, Wendy, who was helping to clean up with her girls, said to me that it was amazing to see that this could still happen, that the shul could come alive this way, that people were still interested in coming and participating. And I have felt since that time that that was the beginning of the renaissance of the synagogue, and the possibilities were there of what we could build together. And my generation coming in and putting in their time and their love, and Wendy and Johnny and everything that has grown from that has all been uphill ever since that original production. There were a group of us at the synagogue, Jeffrey Levy, Carla Goldstein, Debbie Minden, that we all were December babies who started school early, who were ahead of ourselves. And when we were in public school, we were always surrounded by kids who were 1 to 2 years older than us. And at Hebrew school, we were together, and there was a bond. Our families knew each other, and it was just a great feeling. And we were terrible. Like, we did terrible things to our teachers. And I remember when we were in the little house, we had this Hebrew teacher named Mr. Bagola, and I know I drove him crazy. And one day he threw me out of class, and in another classroom you could get out of that window onto a big flat roof. And I was bored, so I climbed out onto the roof, and then I decided that I would edge around. The front of the building was all glass where the stairwell was, and I'm standing on the outside of the windows on the second floor of this building, and Mr. Bagola happens to look out the door of the classroom and sees me standing on this ledge. And I got into serious trouble, right, for doing that. But they were just fun times. And then Faye Schmerling, she came to teach. My class was her first Hebrew school class, and she was wonderful. I had a crush on her, and they were just really good times, really good times. But she had such a nice way about her, and she was so enthused about teaching us. Because in fact, even though we'd all gone to Hebrew school for many years, we really didn't know a lot because we misbehaved all the time. But Faye inspired, I know, not just me, but the other kids, and all of a sudden we were really reading Hebrew and really getting into the stories and what the real history was behind it. And she was so enthused about it, and she'd get us to act things out. And I remember that we did some, I don't know, a song. I remember, I don't know what the class assignment was, but taking Oh What a Beautiful Morning and singing it in Hebrew. And I still to this day remember the words to that song in Hebrew. And I attribute that and that feeling of connection to our history and to what it meant to really be a Jew after all these thousands of years of Jews. I felt that came from Faye for me.
Can you sing the song, Oh What a Beautiful Morning?
I can probably sing Amanayahu haboker, Amanayahu hayom, belibi zeha regesh, regesh kulo b'chalom.